You're listening to The Hikam with Shaykh Zahir Bacchus of the Lotri Foundation. In this podcast, Shaykh Zahir explains the aphorisms from Ibn Ata'illah's famous book of wisdoms, Al-Hikam Al-Ata'iyah, a classical manual of spiritual development. Visit seekershub.org for online courses, our reliable answer service, and engaging media.
Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما بفضلك وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم آمين. We're in this, we read this book. It's by Shaykh Ibn Ata'illah Iskandari, one of the great scholars of the past, on self-development or self-awareness. And it's just, statements that lead one back to understandings one's relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes in understanding, there's levels of understanding one's position with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just like there's levels in how one feels in one's worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so, because there's different levels of one's certainty, one's yaqeen with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it differs with people, their state with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because people's state with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala differs because they come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and they come as gifts from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. People's state with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes as gifts, and people's perception also differs. People's perceptions of the gifts that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends to them, ni'mah, blessings Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends to them, differs also. So that some people, the gifts that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends to them it has to be something visual, or something that they see they can benefit in this world with. Those are gifts that they see. They're things that they can see, or that they can feel, or that they can witness in their lives, that benefits them in this world. And so they're thankful for those benefits or those gifts. There are other gifts that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends that are sometimes more indiscernible, that are not clear, but they're gifts in the same time. Those gifts, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, sometimes the person themselves are veiled from seeing it. They don't see it. It's undiscernible. Like the gift of health. The gift of health, most people, some people will ignore thanking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for blessing them health until when? Until it's taken away from them. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's act and His power and His will and His divine attributes are always discernible by those who perceive them. Whether one is thankful of it or not, those gifts from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they're always here. They're here. And so sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has to take things away in order for one to witness or to see His actions in it. Or sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has to send a veil or has to send something down in order for you to thank Him, or for you to witness Him, or for you to be gracious in the fact that He is the Lord, or He is Ar-Rahman, or He is the merciful or the compassionate. There's two ways for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to display His attributes to the servant. One is positive, and one is a negation of that attribute. For instance, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, people ask for His mercy. We ask for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy. We can verify Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being merciful to us. So, someone gets sick that we love, or we get sick, Nasr al-Afiyah, and we ask for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy in that sickness, especially if it's a hard sickness or illness. The mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is sometimes displayed by Him making you healthy. Sometimes it happens overnight, sometimes it's a long process. Sometimes through the illness is something of benefit. So you see the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in itself. You see it. And sometimes with a lack of or a negation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's attribute, you can see the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was merciful to you and provided for you. And through His mercy, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provided dunya to you, wealth to you, health to you, kids to you, food to you, clothing to you, friends to you, whatever it is, the ability to worship Him to you. That's through His mercy. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala removes it, your ability to worship Him, your ability to eat, your ability to have wealth to spend, your ability to work, your ability to do whatever, the removal of it is also a proof of His mercy. But because His mercy allowed you to do those things, so the removal of it got you to witness His mercy in reflection, and not while it was happening or while those gifts were being displayed to the servant. So the servant, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the servant is either going to witness Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the positive elements of His attributes and His displaying of His of gifts to the servant, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the servant's going to witness Allah's attribute by the removal of those gifts, by the removal of those things. And so that is the understanding. Whether one is veiled or not veiled, the person can see or can witness or can verify Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's existence or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's attribute upon them or upon her. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the person can see it or witness it or understand it. They can understand it. And so in this hikmah that we'll cover, there's an interesting thing. When we teach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in the Quran, in various places, chapter Rum, there's verses, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and from His ayah is the fluctuation of night and day. Night comes, day disappears, and then it comes. The sun setting, the sun rising, the birds going out and coming back fed at night. All these are proof of what? Of the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are proof of the qahar, of the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or subjugation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are proof of the rahmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or they're proof of the awe of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All of it. The world is a proof of the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It leads to that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, فَانْظُرْ, to look at athar rahmatullah in one verse. Look at the traces or the vestiges of Allah's mercy in the world. because it leads you back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is one way of it. However, there are categories of believers that reach a rank with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through their worship and through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala endowing them with a gift that they don't need the creation to confirm or to verify, or the creation is not a dalil for Allah. The opposite occurs. The dalil of the creation is found in Allah, in one's verification and one's understanding that Allah exists. The verification of Allah's subhanahu existence is the proof for creation. It's the other way around. The proof of the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that everything is under the control of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and within the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is in what? In the existence and the firm belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and not the other way around. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the dalil for the subsistence of creation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the understanding of it. And this is what is meant in certain ayahs of the Quran. So we'll look at what he says, Ibn Ata'illah. So he says, رحمة عليه مما يدلك على وجود القهره سبحانه أن حجبك عنه بما ليس بموجود معه. So he says, Ibn Ata'illah, he says that of that which directs you to his all conquering power or subjugation, to that which yudilluka, to that which points you or directs you to his all conquering power, is that he's veiled you. This is veiling you from him. This is veiling you from him with that which has no being apart from him, that which has no existence or being apart from him, that has no existence with him. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala directs you to his qahar, his all conquering and power. And how does he do it? How does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do it? This is what Ibn Ata'illah says. He says he veils you from him. He veils you from him with that which has no being apart from him. He veils you through the creation. So that one, how do we understand what he's saying? How do we understand what he's saying? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how does he veil you from him with that which has no being than him? Those who worship idols. Those who worship idols, or they worship things, or they believe that the power is in the hands of something of this world, and they're veiled from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they believe that these things, dunyawi things, idols, whatever they take up with idols, money, wealth, whatever, will take money, because money can act as an idol to people. They worship it. People worship money and wealth today. They set it up in the place of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It has no existence with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nothing has any place along with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the person is veiled from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The person is veiled. And they see money as their God. And they think they can get anything, buy anything, do anything with their wealth. They are in complete worship of their money. That's why the Prophet ﷺ, he says, Ka'is Abdul Dinar Dirham, that the woe to the person that they're going to lose the slave of the gold coins and silver coins. So because they're slaves of it, so they set it up as a ilah, as a god, their wealth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they see how are they going to witness the overwhelming power, or directs them to the overwhelming power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're veiled from seeing Allah from Him, by Him, with that wealth that they have, that they think that they can get anything, do anything they want. Anything and everything that they want. They think that they can do it. Although it has no place alongside with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, obviously, because it's creation. What happens? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends them something that their money cannot solve. Or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives them something that they cannot possibly spend all their money to restore or to gain back. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to take a loved one from them, all their money is not going to buy their loved one back. So they witness the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They witness the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even though they've been veiled with that money, with that wealth. They've been veiled by that wealth. They've been veiled by that wealth from who? From Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is veiling you from Him with that which has no being apart from Him. So they're veiled. And that veiling allows them to what? To then witness the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What do they witness? The attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They witness an attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then they say, and they would say, and they do say, that this money and all this wealth that I've amassed, that I worshipped, that I thought that I was the most powerful, and I thought I can do anything I want. What happens? It doesn't buy anything that is worthy of buying. So what do they witness? The power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They witness the jaleel of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what they witness. And so these are the people that witness it. And this is what in all things, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to witness Him. But you have to be a person of perception. You have to perceive things. And you have to make understand that things are occurring, and everything is occurring with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So for the servants ourselves, what do we take from it? What we take from it is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, كُلُّ شَيْءٍ هَالِكٌ, that everything is perishing. إِلَّا وَجْهَهُ, except the countenance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, everything. And the word, this halikun, kullu shay'in halikun, is that it's occurring, and it keeps occurring, right? Everything is perishing except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Everything is not worth or is not valued anything because it's going out of existence. And the only thing in existence is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Everything goes out, in and out of existence. Everything goes in and out of existence because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills it as such. He creates it and then He takes it out of existence. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says all things are passing, or all things are leaving, halikun, perishing or passing, except His countenance. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, Huwa awwalu, that He is the first and the last, and He is the outward and He is the hidden or the inward. There's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He says, wherever you turn, فَثَمَّ وَجْهُ اللَّهِ, wherever you turn to, you will see the countenance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Huwa kuntu aynama kunt, and He is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is there, or He's with you wherever you are. He is with you wherever you are, meaning that the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one cannot escape the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One cannot escape it. One cannot escape it. It's our perception of it itself. Like the hadith Qudsi that is found. It's found in the end of the Arba'een. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says through the words of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he quotes it, the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, he says, Ya ibadi, O my servant, when I was ill, you did not visit me. When I was ill, you did not visit me. And the servant says to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the servant replies, he says, O my Lord, how is it that I could have visited you? How could I have visited you? And of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free from illness, obviously. This is metaphorically speaking these words. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is above being sick because it would induce a weakness. And a Lord can never be, or a Lord can never have any weaknesses at all. Weakness is a state of creation. It's not the state of ilah, it's not the state of a Lord. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says metaphorically, O my slave, I was ill, you did not visit me. And the servant says, O Lord, how could I visit you when you are the Lord of the worlds? When you are free from any imperfections? And how could I visit you when you're free from any imperfection? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, my slave so-and-so was ill and you did not visit him. If you had visited him, you would have found me with him. If you had visited him, you would have found me with him. You would have found me with him. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, wherever you are, Allah is there. His existence is there. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free of any corporeal being, any place, any direction, anything. And so the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His attributes are present, are there, are mawjood, are in existence. And so the perception of the servant for this hadith is what? Is that Allah, we try to be at places where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward us or bless us, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will favor us more. There are places, no matter where you go, there are places that there's more blessings than not, like the masajid. There are places that are sacred, like the masajid, or praying in the masjid rather than home, or praying in the haram or the haramain is more blessed. Because why? Because you get more rewards for it, obviously. And so wherever you are, there is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, wherever you are, in the perception of the servant, in the certainty of the servant, in how the servant perceives things to be. And then he says, and he quotes this quote by Imam Abu Hassan al-Shadili. He says, إِنَّ لِتَنْظُرْ إِلَى اللَّهِ تَعَالَى بِنَظْرِ الْإِيمَانِ وَالْإِتْقَانِ. Imam Shadili, he says that indeed we gaze towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with sight of faith and certainty. With sight of faith and of certainty. He says, and then he says, وَيُغِيبْ أَنَا ذَلِكَ أَنْ دَلِيلُ وَبُرْحَانِ. And what does it يغنينا? So what does it do when we gaze towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with the sight of faith and certainty? And it frees us from any proof. It frees us from any proof of His existence. Any need, that we don't have any need for any proof, dalil wal burhan, any proof for it. وَنَسْتَدِلُّ بِهِ عَلَى الْخَلْقِ. And what happens then? We use Him, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to prove the existence of creation. We use Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to prove what? The existence of creation. The complete opposite. It's the complete opposite of it. فَإِنَّهُ لَيْسَ فِي الْوُجُودِ إِلَّا الْوَاحِدَ الْحَقِّ. And we use Him to prove the existence of creation. Is there anything in existence except Allah, subhanahu wa ta'ala? Is there anything in existence except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? فَلَا نَرَاهُمْ, and we do not see them. We do not see people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, He says, وَلَا نَرَاهُمْ, we do not see them. وَإِنْ كَانَ وَلَا بُدْ فَنَرَاهُمْ كَالْهَبَاءِ فِي الْحَوَىٰ. And if we were to see them, what we would see? We would see them just dust in the winds, particles. We would just see them as particles. Meaning what? That they're insignificant. If we were to see them, creation, what we would see them? We would just see them as insignificant. Why would you see them as insignificant? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in control of everything. We put value in people and in the creation, and we put value in their actions and what they say, even though it's insignificant to your Lord, even though it's insignificant to what your Lord wants you to be or wants to give to you. It's insignificant. Someone may say the worst things to you. It is completely insignificant because their words don't matter when you stand before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They may praise you or they may deride you. That does not matter. The actions of people do not matter. They may throw dirt on you or they may heap wealth upon you. It does not matter. The only thing that matters is what Allah gives to you or what He withholds from you. That's it. The only thing that matters is whether Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala descends upon you His mercy and His forgiveness or not. It doesn't matter. So when you see that, what do you see? You see people as particles. They're just particles in the air. That's all they become. People just become insignificant because that's in the realm of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In the realm of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you see them as particles in the air. I don't recommend you go home and say this to your wife without the context, because she's not going to like it. And we have to listen and we have to obey to a certain extent. This is for my friends in the basement. Getting back on track. This is in the realm of our iman. This is what he's talking about. He's talking about our iman. When you see, because people, what's important about Imam Shadli's quotation here? And you find this, if you just take a ride on a subway at 7 a.m. or 8 a.m. in the morning in Toronto or any major city, and you look at people's faces, their faces tell you the story of their life. And what does the story tell you? Their story tell you of their lack of certainty with their Lord. That's what their faces tell you. That people are destroyed, their lives and their happiness are destroyed because of what people say to them or what people do to them. So people are not particles in the air, as Imam Shadli says. People become their ilah, they become their gods, or their work, or their employer, or their manager, or their boss, or their wives, or their children, or their grandparents, or their fathers, or their mothers, or whoever they are, becomes their ilah, becomes their God. And so what happens? Their happiness are in their hands. Their sadness are in their hands. Their approval are in their hands. Instead of them being particles of the creation in the air, they become the things that make them happy or make them sad or make them joyful or make them happy. If one has understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and one is focused on one's Lord and in care of what one Lord thinks of one or not, one is only either in rida of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or fearing. Either one has raja, hope of Allah, or one is in awe or fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's it. That's it. One sadness is over not worshipping Allah more. One sadness is in not worshiping Allah more. or one's happiness is in fulfilling the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or thanking Allah for giving you gifts, and not the other way around. So in that itself is what? Is that the proof of the creation becomes what? Becomes in the very existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The proof of the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala becomes in the fact that one has witnessed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not the other way around. The other way around is for people who start off on the path, the people who need to have that perspective and that awe of the dalil, of proof of the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For those who are seeking closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it becomes the other way around. It becomes the other way around. And so we have to remove ourselves from setting up, gods to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and strictly rely on Allah, Al-Qahhar, Al-Wahid, the one and only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ar-Rahman, the one who sends His mercy. One has to have perception of it. One just has to have perception of it. One can never, how can one lose faith through the words of people when it's Allah who's in charge of the affairs? How could one lose faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through the actions of people when Allah is in charge of the affair? If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to prevent you from something, it's in His hands, it's not in people's hands. It's in His hands and not in people's hands. And so we go back to Him and ask Him, and we don't ask anyone else. That's the understanding. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us to understand faith and iman. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us to be practicing servants. May Allah subhanahu in the month of Rabi'ul Awwal, may He cause us to bring our love towards the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, not only in words but in deeds. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us to implement the sunnah of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam in closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In states, may Allah subhanahu imbue us with states that are blessings, that are states that help us to impede or help us not to impede the progress to Him. May Allah subhanahu lift the veils between us and Him. Help us to see Him in all of His actions. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive us and protect us, protect our children, give them success in this world, success in the next world. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us and help them. May Allah subhanahu those who are faced with difficulties, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help them through their difficulties, give them patience to deal with it. May Allah subhanahu help in their adversity. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make their adversity something that is praiseworthy for them, benefits them in this world. In the next world, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us, our elders, our parents, give them good health, long life. Those who have passed away, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant them His mercies, maghfirah, His shade on that day when there's no shade except His. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us all homes of the mu'mineen, and grant from our homes that are filled with nur, and that the shaitan and devil flee from. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make our last words our best words. Subhanaka alhamdulillah, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.
Thank you for listening to The Hikam with Shaykh Zahir Bacchus. Help Seekers Hub spread the light of guidance to millions around the world by supporting us through monthly donations by going to seekershub.org/donate. Your donations are tax deductible in the US and Canada.